In the Fertile Crescent rose the first organized cities of Earth. Inside the houses of these mysterious dwellers, we find remains of skulls that are from the same family line. They worked as home altars, and through these remains of their ancestors, they worshipped them in rituals that we don't have any recordings left. We still have ancestral worship all over the world's cultures, but in Europe, the evidence has been blurred or it has been synthesized in the Catholic lore. We have a nice piece of evidence for these practices in Europe from the 18th century, from an ethnic group of forest Finns. They were Finns living in central Sweden's forests, being somewhat separate from the mainstream Swedish culture, since they had a different language and were living in frontier lands. There are recorded cases of forest Finns burying limbs of their deceased inside their houses to bring good luck for the household. Forest Finns were of course Lutherans and thought of themselves as Christians, but they were obviously carrying very old pagan customs in this grotesque storing of body parts inside their house. Ancestral worship was not simple worshipping of the skulls, but the house itself. If you ever meet a Finnish person, his or her surname most likely comes from the name of the house that his ancestors once resided in. The name of the house usually comes from a specific shape of the terrain that belonged to the household, or in some cases the name can show clear connection to the lost pagan world, being quite mysterious with its origin. Inside the Finnish houses there were different kind of creatures dwelling who had a clear ancestral connection to the peasants. The main guardian of the house is called haltija in Finnish. It literally means the possessor or the owner. When Lords of the Rings was translated to Finnish, the translator gave this name for elves in the book. After that, all elves carry the name haltija in fantasy literature. But don't be fooled. Elves or Alfwits and haltija have nothing to do with each other. The Finns are culturally agnatic kinship society where the oldest son would continue the household. When younger male heirs would move out to a different house or establish a brand new house, they would keep the connection to the original house by removing some ashes from the fireplace or even removing a brick from it, which they would place in their new home. By doing so, they took the guardian of the house with them, or at least part of the guardian. This practice gives us the first clue that the ancestor guardian lived in the fireplace of the house. That is the vital heart of the household that gave life to it. Although Finns had patrilineal culture, haltija could also be in female form. To become haltija or guardian in the house involved doing something for the first time in the newly established house. Sleeping there, or stepping inside of the door for the first time, or even making the first fire at the fireplace. Once person becomes haltija, his or her consciousness was one with the house. The concept of self-consciousness was very interesting in the pagan world. Nobody really dies completely, and their soul is built from various different aspects that can be split from the human body, like shadows. Because nobody really dies or leaves us, people were afraid of ghosts returning to their houses. So a lot of rituals were done to separate the dead from the living. In old burial customs, we can see the cult of house continuing. Graves were known as the dead's homes, and people even built house-like graves with roofs, windows, to give them a new house. The house worth living was only for their first known ancestor. You could not separate the establisher from their house. Haltija's name and role seems to have evolved through time with lots of ancestral worship rituals. Guardians would face miniaturization in their appearance. Nisse, or tonttu as it is called in Finnish, took the role of haltija around the household. Later these creatures turned into Santa's little helpers, but before that they were keeping their order and rules in the house. Everyone had to live in strict rules so that these new guardians would not be disturbed. You could not shout, drink, or urinate in the sauna, for example, or this little gnome of the sauna would straighten you out in anger. The ancestral spirit kept guarding the household, even though the myth became more blurred with these mysterious dwellers. There was still a clear connection to the fireplace, because these soon-to-become Santa's helpers had red clothing and hats that symbolized the fire of the house. The house owners would sacrifice for the house builder in a corner dedicated to the guardian with various food items. There was usually a reserved place for the guardian of the house. When Christianity arrived, these altars would remain in their place, but would be filled with icons of the saints instead. Still, some old ladies tried to give food sacrificed to them by throwing salt at the icons and rubbing the saints' lips with butter and commanding them to feast on their sacrifice. We often overlook how full of social norms and customs our table manners are. Eating is a communal event, and that is why the food sacrifices were so important to the ancient people. With Christianity, this house cult was somewhat muffled, but Haltia and all the various spirits remained alive in folklore. Ancestors were most likely remembered by calling their names in remembrance, if we examine the customs of calling past generations during different kind of celebrations. This was done during the feast, of course. It makes me think that the hardest path for the conversion to the Christianity was making the local population to adapt Christian names. Peasants usually gave very same names in the household for each generation. I guess this was a way to keep remembering all the names of the ancestors as a pleasant task, but once the names had been changed or turned into a format that would please the both parties, then they could be remembered by their loved ones by calling these familiar names during different celebrations. It is interesting how much this cult of the house has experienced with these syntheses of different folklores and the coming of Christianity. Although clan society was disbanded, the idea of family unit remained alive all the way to the Reformation, when Martin Luther gave us individual ego that should strike its mark for the Lord. But think about it, it is very nice to have a home, when this unit of home provides warmth and life around cruel nature. For Finns, home life was the central way of their life. There were harsh winters that locked them inside for most of the year, but luckily, the original establisher of the house would keep the fire of life going.